Hey guys, this is Tyler here. I'm in Estonia, and I want to talk to everyone why PUA has really decreased for Generation X. Now, I've spoken about PUA for Generation Y and Z primarily, but this is for the Xers here. Truthfully, this is my favorite generation in terms of friendships. For people who are Generation X, you guys obviously had a very unique era because you guys had traditional relationships starting primarily in the 1980s into the 1990s. And then, of course, you saw the advent of new technologies, of PUA, of all these different options that came into the marketplace. And many people have all sorts of opinions here on the impact. But one thing is for sure is that PUA was arguably started during Generation X era. Now, there's well-known guys like Strauss and Tucker Max that are some of the early figures of the PUA movement in USA and worldwide. And these guys became very well known. Some of them became phenomenally wealthy from their content, their books and videos that they sold, and became very well known. PUA was a very unknown concept up until like the late 1990s. There was guys that did it. I mean, unofficially, it was of course being done for many decades before. It just was very uncommon. It was not mainstream before this point. And once the late 90s hit, there were some big names that came into play, and guys realized they could make a lot of money from this because the 90s was probably the first decade where we started seeing more guys having difficulties with dating and relationships. It was more common than before because guys obviously prior to this, I think, just felt there was more options and there was just a generally a higher level of respect given towards men. PUA kind of became seen as this be-all end-all to guys' dating problems, and I think that's how it was sold. It was very much being able to put on a show to go on dates and maybe be in a relationship, but I think it was more about getting in the bedroom, especially for guys that weren't having a lot of success with this. And it was targeted, of course, more to younger guys, but it was also for guys who were older, 30s, 40s, 50s. And these guys were introducing techniques that were very unknown to the masses. And this is why these initial guys made a lot of money. They made a lot more money compared to. One thing we notice here is that in the early days, it was quite effective. PUA was something you could go to New York, Chicago, Nashville, Miami. There was very few guys doing it, so it hadn't really saturated the marketplace. So until this point, most guys were meeting their girlfriends through social circles, through school or work. And many guys had girlfriends. They have problems finding relationships. As more guys became single and left out on the market, this arose a great opportunity for these guys, these creators of PUA. And so they introduced this. It became pretty big into the early 2000s. And then we saw like international PUA where guys were traveling to foreign countries like Thailand, Ukraine, Russia, and they were utilizing these techniques in other countries, and it worked even better often because it was both unpracticed in those countries, that it was very novel to being foreign, these guys, and it was PUA. It was psychological techniques that could work on almost any woman at this point in time. It relied a lot on comedy, on improvisation and confidence, these sort of skills that actually play quite a role in sales and in marketing, in business and companies. This is the very similar kind of techniques here. The difference being is that you're trying to sell yourself on being able to go on a date and be in a relationship with a girl. As time progressed, more and more guys started realizing these techniques existed and started practicing them in their own life. If they were single, they were looking for a girlfriend or wife and were desiring to have something, they learned about these guys and they bought their videos, their books, and started utilizing it in whatever city they were living in. And often it would work. In the early days, it truthfully worked. Now, especially for guys that were not very good looking, they maybe lacked social status or they didn't make a lot of money. They could learn these skills and potentially greatly optimize their chances on the dating market because much of this actually utilized personal attributes, skills. There was, of course, an emphasis focused on personal appearance, how you physically portray yourself, because much of PUA isn't just verbal, it's also physical cues that you're giving off to the person. But it gave more of a chance to guys that were often left out of the dating marketplace. That could be shorter guys or guys that didn't make a lot of money, they lacked social status. Some of these guys had a lot of success. And also another group that where I think we saw this introduced a whole nother area was the multi-ethnic or multi-racial relationships / marriages. I really believe that PUA was unofficial PUA, and PUA were big factors in the promotion and in moving of that area. That kind of goes into a different area here. I won't really talk about it in this video, but yes, it helped many guys have a better chance of going on dates with women, possibly getting in the bedroom or finding a relationship or spouse. And it worked for so many years. But like anything, as it became more saturated domestically, internationally, it became more ineffective because more and more guys learned about it and started using it. And it lost its novelty. And also the whole dating and relationship behaviors were changing. In the early years, it was more Generation X. There was a more genuine and sincere mentality, I think, with relationships. People were often better for their word. Men and women were better, and they weren't being sought out by as many people. So they were much more focused, concentrated on the person in front of them. They weren't focused all the chaos around them. Whereas it started shifting over. And due to this generational emergence of like Generation Y started coming into play, and they had been raised a little differently. Their behaviors were different. Relationships and the respect in relationships with men and women was different often than Generation X, and this created a different environment. So PUA was losing its effectiveness, especially like in domestic markets. You could still travel, of course, to like Eastern European countries, to Southeast Asia, and it was still working, but not so much domestic wise. And guys start realizing this, especially in like the later 2000s. In the later 2000s, guys started comprehending this fact that it wasn't going to work because it was too saturated, and the whole mindset was different generation, and the overall respect was going down. Because remember, it was both due to the apps, the PUA in itself, and also the culture was changing, it was shifting, which all made it more and more ineffective. PUA in many ways actually relied on an effective amount of trust and integrity on both parties, especially from the woman's side. But as that side started declined, they lost the trust and respect. It became ineffective very quickly for guys to utilize. Yes, if a guy was very good, they had very good humor, they would often have to rely on very good looks, lots of charisma, and maybe even social status. It could work still. But the guy that was short, that was bald, that was not considered high social status or unattractive, not nearly as effective as it had been, say, 10 years before. 2000 compared to 2010, and especially 15 years later, 2015. It was really becoming less useful, and guys started realizing this by the month, by the year. I think women too are also becoming more narcissistic at this time. They had always been narcissistic. I think it just became more heightened with like social media and dating apps, and just a lot more attention be given on them. There were a lot more single guys that didn't have relationships, like girlfriends and wives, than ever before, and that became a more problematic. As more of these single guys started entering the marketplace, it made the competition for the single women higher, and so there were more desperate and single guys than ever before, because it was becoming more and more difficult to marry, and also some guys were opting not to marry. The age of marriage was going up, and more saturation of attention was naturally being given to women. And because we have to remember this, that if we look at the PUA era from like the 1990s, late 1990s or even mid 90s, there weren't nearly as many men that were single, that were, say, not married or in relationships. And there weren't a lot of the, say, immigrants, like we saw a lot of these single male immigrants entering the US and other Western countries like in the early 2000s. This wasn't really in the equation as much, and this was a big contention area that guys had to start dealing with, and it just negated the effectiveness of PUA for most guys. And so what it was starting to happen, especially in bigger cities, is that you would have to be a guy that could have success in a normal social setting with a woman for PUA to even be effective. If you were to then use PUA, if you weren't already like one of these pre-selected, it would probably not even work. And also note that the percentage of success for PUA, whether it was domestically or internationally, was also declining big time. If you look at over like a 15-year period, the percentage of success, even in USA cities, was maybe like 20% for a guy who was really good, whereas it was declining to maybe like 1 or 2% of that for a guy in a big city, for an average guy. Maybe for an above average guy, it was better. And for guys who were below, it could even be worse than that. It could be virtually ineffective. These were all factors that played a role. And also for the late guys that were past the 2010 decade, then they had to start worrying about like girl power, Me Too movements that were becoming a big concern for men all across society at that point. Now, yeah, many of those guys, Generation X guys, by that point were out of the game, but there were still some that were there. I mean, certainly, I mean, some men would still continue 40s, 50s, continue dating or be in relationships. Some of these guys, of course, were using PUA because they couldn't use other methods. Other methods weren't effective, and they may have had social status. They took good care of themselves. They had good charisma and social skills. So these guys maybe were still using PUA, probably had less desire to when they saw what was happening in the environment, in society, and realized that they could get charged with some really severe things and possibly get incarcerated. And so it was declining big time, especially for Generation X, because by that point, these men were older. The youngest Generation X guys were probably like in their 30s. By that age, of course, many guys have less desire to date than, say, a guy in their late teens or early 20s. And I also think, I've mentioned this in previous videos, is guys start realizing too it was just more of a show. It wasn't going to be an effective long-term strategy to seek out like a woman as spouse material, because some of these guys were seeking an actual spouse and realized maybe it was just a little game to get into the bedroom for a few weeks, maybe a few months, or just a fling, and that was it. But some of these guys wanted a real partner, a real spouse, and understood this wasn't working. They had to use other means that would essentially give more validation to them as a guy, to them as a high quality man, and PUA was losing utility. The biggest reason, of course, I think, is just the fact that generation change. Like anyone, as younger become older, then the young compete against the old. Generation Y then came along and probably were the biggest reason why they kind of left the game, because they knew that they would then be competing against, say, 20-year-olds, and it was, these guys knew their chances would go down, and they just had less desire. They knew, kind of passed on the reins, so to speak, moved on. Some still continue to this day. It really depends. I know of some guys, Generation X, that still do the PUA, and some do have success, but many have left the game, and we saw guys like Roosh complete reform, complete transformation, and I know other guys that had some kind of transformation experience. It seems very common for the guys in the PUA movement. This transformation period seems so common in this area for guys that were like the leaders of PUA. And there's been other scenarios like Roosh, and they've spoken about the past and their history with it and why they changed their mindset on it. And these are not all the factors here. There's other things I did not include, but these are the main ones, and I look forward to your feedback below. Thank you.